Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hey everyone, I am super excited for this episode and this interview today because I am featuring the author of probably one of my favorite history books of all time. I'm talking with Jason Roberts, who is the author of the book A Sense of the World: How a Blind Man Became History's Greatest Traveler. We're going to talk all about the life of James Holman. He was a solitary, blind traveler who lived from 1786 to 1857. And every story that you hear about him, you think, that can't be possible. That's the most unbelievable thing I've ever heard someone do. And then you hear another story that tops that. So just a few examples. He fought the slave trade in Africa. He survived a frozen captivity in Siberia when he was trying to travel overland on Russia on nothing but a sledge with a driver who didn't speak the same language as him and actually almost made it. He hunted elephants in Sri Lanka. He helped chart the Australian outback. He circumnavigated the globe on sail ship before steam engines were around. He traveled 250,000 miles, the distance from Earth to the moon, more than 10 times farther than Marco Polo. So, and now I talk with Jason, we're going to get into all the impossible to believe stories that come from Holman's life. And just a few of them are that how Holman, after he went blind, he was able to retrain his senses to basically use echolocation and see the world like a bat. And by doing so, he was able to ride a horse at full gallop. He could walk on the street and know that women were passing him and doff his hat to them like a gentleman. He could go to a crowded restaurant and find his friend there. How he summited Mount Vesuvius as it was on the brink of a volcanic eruption. And he managed to negotiate a peace treaty between the British Navy and islanders in Equatorial Guinea. So I had a blast talking with Jason about James Holman. Really recommend you check out Jason's book, A Sense of the World: How a Blind Man Became History's Greatest Traveler, for more information on this. And I hope you enjoy this talk. Jason, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you, Scott. I appreciate you having me on.
Now, I'm not going to lie. I'm just about as excited as I've ever been on this podcast because you've written definitely in my top 5 favorite books. So I'll just put it out there that I can't wait to get into this. And there are so many stories about James Holman that when you tell them to people, you can't believe that this is true. Well, let's just start off with this before we get into the chronology of his life. Of all the stories of James Holman, of the dangerous animals he shot, of the daring do that he did, is there any particular story or thing that he did that stands out to you as your favorite?
Yes, I would believe that would be when he helped fight the slave trade in West Africa. He was part of the first settlement of what is now the sovereign nation of Equatorial Guinea. Back then it was an island called Fernando Po, and it was established by the British Royal Navy as an outpost for fighting the slave trade. And he somehow wrangled his way onto the expedition to do this. And there was a point where they were trying to negotiate treaties with the local natives, and the seamen who were sent to go negotiate the treaty kept disappearing. And James Holman volunteered to go by himself, and he simply took the hand of a native and disappeared up into the uncharted mountaintop forest where really no European had gone before, much less a blind person, and personally undertook the negotiations with the local chieftain, which in many ways helped continue to fight the slave trade, and in many ways led to the establishment of what I say is now a sovereign nation. And in fact, there was the Holman River, which was named in his honor in Africa as a result of that. This is just a particular case of, it isn't that he didn't take no for an answer. He didn't even wait to ask the question. So he still is a very, very impressive person. And I have to say that this is one of the cases where it's easy to accept compliments like yours, Scott, with full humility, because it really was not a case of me trying to write an amazing book. It was simply a case of me trying to transcribe what was an amazing story.
And that's what I'd love to get into at the end of our discussion of how did he do what he did? Was it mere talent? Was it dogged determinist? Did he have some sort of order of operations of solving a problem? And I want to dig into that, but to give context of how amazing his problem-solving abilities was, it's good to, first of all, hear a story, which is what we can look at. But to set the stage, first of all, can you describe what was it like to be a blind person in Holman's lifetime? He's born in the late 18th century, lives in the early 19th century. Whether you're born blind or become blind, what was your life like?
Well, Scott, this is one of the most interesting things about writing history, as I know you know, is that the process isn't just one of learning, but it's one of unlearning. And to arrive at a clear understanding of what the past was like, you quite often have to very surprisingly discard some of your most treasured notions. And one of the things that we have that we're not even aware of is that we are at the receiving end of over a century and a half of sensitivity training toward the disabled, toward the differently abled. And we do, in fact, look at somebody doing something while blind and see that as being an act of triumph, an act of nobility. Well, there's two things we have to understand is that, one, that kind of culture did not exist at the time. And secondly, there was very much a huge stigma for being blind, particularly for being a young blind man, because James Holman, as you know, was a 25-year-old lieutenant in the Royal Navy when he went blind. At that particular time, the number one source of blindness among men of that age was syphilis. So it's quite possible that whenever he walked into a room wearing his naval uniform and trying to, scope out the place without hitting things too aggressively with his stick, they were probably gasps, but they were gasps of disdain, because the quick assumption that people would go to would be that he had lost his sight due to syphilis. And that, in fact, is one of the reasons why he seems to have worked so hard to become a Knight of Windsor, which was the kind of semi-nobility, semi-charity that he was a part of at that time, because being a Knight of Windsor was itself a testament to the idea that he was not a victim of a sexual disease. So there was that he had to deal with. But then there's just also the fact that people were vastly entertained by the blind people, and the homes for blind people were called asylums. And in many cases, they were in fact right side by side with insane asylums, because the idea that they needed to engage fully with the real world was itself not even a notion. And it wasn't common for people at that time to go to county fairs, exhibitions, that sort of thing. And one of the amusements would be to hire blind people and tell them to try to do something. And then they do something on stage for comic effect. And it would be quite interesting. They would round up multiple blind people, put them up on stage, start giving them directions, and then people would laugh at the idea that these people don't know what they're doing with each other. That's humiliating, but more humiliating still was the idea that these people were glad to get that kind of money. There really was no notion that a blind person had any kind of mainstreaming whatsoever. So the distance that Holman had to travel just from social acceptance to be allowed to walk quietly down the street itself and traffic to get out of the way was a far greater journey than I had imagined when I started out to write the book.
Yeah, and can you describe his early life, his naval career, and how he came down with blindness? Because as you said, it wasn't just a case of syphilis.
Yes, it doesn't seem to be a case of syphilis. There are not clear clinical details, but what he was originally invalided for in the Royal Navy was rheumatoid arthritis. And that was really fascinating because I had to look deeply into that. And I found that what had happened is that he had been a midshipman in the Navy, and he was required to stand night watch on ships that were running the American blockade in the War of 1812. So he was literally on board ships that would spend months and months at sea without ever touching land. They would literally go from Canada to Jamaica and turn back around again. And as the junior officer, he needed to be on decks at the night watch. He also had to be what's called the weather helm, which is on the side of the ship that is more exposed to the weather. And I looked into this, and I found that it really, really was not at all unusual for naval midshipmen at that time and of his age to become really quite disabled, if not disfigured, with early-stage rheumatoid arthritis. So that's what he was complaining about. And that's actually what he was originally invalided for in the Navy. And it wasn't until he was in taking the waters at Bath in England, which, as you know, was a very genteel thing to do, that his sight started to diminish. And then eventually he went blind entirely. And that was very fascinating to me because I then had to look into it, and I found out that the autoimmune response that causes most of what we consider rheumatoid arthritis can also cause the loss of eyesight. And in fact, it is still one of the leading causes of loss of eyesight. And in fact, there still isn't a cure for that kind of thing. So I found it quite fascinating that if James Holman had the same condition today, he probably still would have lost his sight.
Right. What did they call it? Ophthalmia, just a general catch-all term for a problem with the eyes?
Yes. They call it idiopathic. Idiopathic uveitis, I believe, is the term. And idiopathic is simply one of those catch-all terms that means we don't know what's causing it. But it is important to understand that, before he became a blind man, he was a crippled man, and that was the key to understanding, to kind of unlocking his personality, is that I came to understand that he was in such pain because his other symptoms of arthritis never went away his entire life. He was in such pain that he seems to have seized upon traveling as a means to distract himself from that pain. And that's the most fascinating thing to me, because he always traveled alone as much as he possibly could. There were a few occasions where he would travel briefly with somebody else, but anytime anybody wanted to offer their assistance to him, he would insist that he's going his own way. The other amazing thing is that I looked and started charting on the map and started charting actually everywhere he had been. And I found an interesting pattern, which was that he almost never, ever retraced his steps. That if anything, he would maybe briefly pass through some capital cities, but his road was entirely built on exposing himself to something new as much as possible. And if you've traveled, that's not normal. There usually is quite practical for you to, spend 2 months in Tuscany and then come back through Rome and then leave through Rome again, that sort of thing. So it was quite striking when I saw those patterns on the map. And that's when I realized that this guy was not just seeking novelty on a general basis. He was seeking novelty on a daily basis. And for me to understand that he basically every day had to be a puzzle for him. He had to wake up, not be quite sure where he was, and have to simply figure out where he's going to go, what he's going to do, reorient himself. And the very effort of doing that, of encountering newness, really seems to be the thing that distracted him from his pain and freed him from his prison. And this was a very romantic notion in my head when I started trying to find this motivation and researching the book. But it wasn't until I went to England and started researching, and I found that he had actually sued the Crown. He had petitioned to Queen Victoria to be allowed to travel, specifically because, as he pointed out, that he had a medical condition that only responded to the vigors of travel. So it was very interesting to find that what was speculation on my point was actually verified in the historical record.
Yeah, and I'd like to hear his joining the Knights of Windsor, because I thought that was a great